Welcome to the Humanities Center and to our conversation with Werner Herzog, who has come up from Los Angeles today to share with us thoughts about his book that all of you have read, of Walking in Ice, on behalf of the Philosophical Reading Group that I run with my colleague Sepp Gumbrecht and The Contemporary, both research unit workshops sponsored by the DLCL. We're thankful to that sponsorship. And Werner, welcome back to Stanford.
Thank you very much. I always enjoyed it to be here and do something. Normally it was films, but this evening, fine, we are dealing with literature. The strange thing is people do not believe me when I'm maintaining that probably the books like of Walking in Ice or Conquest of the Useless will live longer than my films. There's a more direct approach to what I'm expressing in cinema, that you always have a lot of layers in between production and psychology with actors and editing and laboratories in sound and you just name it. So this is a very, very direct form of writing. And in case of Walking in Ice, it was just me and a little diary, a little notebook in my shirt pocket, and walking and writing. So it was instantly written down, not in retrospect, not that I would sit down. Same thing with Conquest of the Useless. It was instantaneously articulated and formulated into prose. And I think the prose that I have written is becoming more known. For example, in Argentina, it's a bestseller, this book, and in Chile now, I was at a meeting in Chile and it was completely overrun and all of a sudden films are not that important, they seem to be secondary, and what I've written seems to be the epicenter of what I'm doing.
That's one of your favorite poets, Hölderlin, said, "What remains the poets establish." So
yeah.
It is in the written
Das
word.
Gründen, die
like
Dichte,
that.
yeah, establish is not a good word for it. Gründen means to lay the foundation, to lay the ground for things. Hölderlin, by the way, is very hard to translate, but there are some very, very serious and good attempts now.
So I also want to draw attention to this other remarkable book, the Werner Herzog, A Guide for the Perplexed, which is Conversations with Paul Cronin, and it goes through a lot, the films, it goes through all your biography, and I mean, this guy has lived a life which is so beyond imagination in terms of action and things that I didn't find any reference to the journey, the walking journey in this conversation with Paul Cronin, which is a 2 to 3 week, for those of us who have just read or reread this book, it's such a remarkable experience that you would think it would be one of the lasting life-marking kind of events, but it just seems to be one of very many different chapters in your life. Can you say a little bit about the motivation and how, because clearly the perplexity is, why would one undertake a trip by foot from Munich to Paris, which has a ritualistic dimension that seems to evoke pilgrimage, quest. Early in your conversation with Paul Cronin, you mentioned that when you went to try to get subsidy for your first films, you were so young that the German producers that you saw just laughed you out of the room as soon as you got in there. Within 15 seconds it was over and you said, that's it, I'm going to create my own
I was a schoolboy actually. I was something like 15, 16
yeah.
and my puberty came late, so I was a little schoolboy. However, they liked my screenplay.
They did like the
and
screenplay.
I found it an outrage that seeing me, they would slap their thighs and scream out, the German film has attracted the kindergarten now. So I thought, you crétins, what I presented here is much better than you ever got on your table. And I started to work the night shift as a welder in a steel factory. During the day I was in school, so I knew what I was doing.
Well, what you did then was you defied all the odds, and it seems that defiance is one of the themes of a lot of your work, of your movie. Fitzcarraldo is not the only example, and I'm wondering if this journey on foot also has an aspect of a defiance, the defiance of death of Lotte Eisner, and in that sense is in keeping with this attitude that I will make this happen, despite the odds.
Yes, it's true, and in a way I would do a thing like that only if there was an existential quest or necessity behind it. Otherwise I would not, I would call it travel on foot, meaning I do not travel as a backpacker. I do not have my tent, my sleeping bag, my cooking utensils in my household on my back. I travel unprotected. I mean, just what I wear on my body and a little duffel bag with a second pair of underwear and a toothbrush and a compass and some binoculars, and that's basically it. And in a way, what has become evident for me is that the world reveals itself to those who travel on foot. I say this, I can say it only as a dictum because nobody nowadays travels on foot. It doesn't happen. You do not find anyone. Sometimes you find backpackers on, let's say, the Appalachian Trail or at the Pacific Trail, but it's a different form of traveling. They are all backpackers in tents and sleeping bags, and they carry food along with them. But I didn't have a tent or anything, so I had to either speak to people and ask them to give me shelter, or I would break into holiday homes or into a parked camping trailer, an exhibition of trailers, and one had a beautiful bed and even a fridge inside of it as an exhibit example, and I just broke into it and slept in it. So you have to do what is necessary when you are unprotected like that.
Definitely a shelterless experience. Can you say, Werner, a word about Lotte Eisner and what she has meant to you and what she meant at that time?
Well, Lotte Eisner, you can read it basically in the postscript in a speech I delivered on her. She was, in a way, my mentor and mentor to many of the young filmmakers in Germany, more so for me because she, in a way, discovered my stuff immediately. She was very deeply impressed by my first long feature film, Signs of Life. And she was in very close touch with Fritz Lang, who lived in the United States at the time in Los Angeles. And Fritz Lang had always said, after the barbarism of the Nazis, there will be no deeper meaning or culturally valuable film coming out of Germany ever. And that was in the 60s, and Lotte Eisner said, yes, there is. There's a young kid who made a film, Signs of Life. She even took a print of the film 35 millimeters and sent it to Fritz Lang, and Fritz Lang answered back, and he was astonished. So she was very instrumental in giving me courage. And when I traveled on foot to her, it had, from my side, and you made an allusion, it had a quality of an incantation almost. And you printed out one page in German, which I will read in a little part of it in German and maybe then in English as well. Can you find it? It's early on in the, just to hear my German voice, and then we'll stay with English. And das Nachdenken über mich fördert eines zutage, der Rest der Welt reimt sich. Ein einziger, alles beherrschender Gedanke, weg von hier. Die Menschen machen mir Angst. Die Eisnerin darf nicht sterben. Die Eisnerin must not die. Sie wird nicht sterben, ich erlaube das nicht. Sie wird nicht sterben, sie wird nicht. Nicht jetzt, das darf sie nicht. Nein, jetzt stirbt sie nicht, weil sie nicht stirbt. Meine Schritte gehen fest und jetzt zittert die Erde. Wenn ich gehe, geht ein Bison. Wenn ich raste, ruht ein Berg. Wehe, sie darf nicht, sie wird nicht. Wenn ich in Paris bin, lebt sie. Es wird nicht anders sein, weil es nicht darf. Sie darf nicht sterben. Später vielleicht, wenn wir es erlauben. And so on, can I see it?
Well, you know, I can read an abbreviated version from the back cover. That's very...
Yeah, I can do that here. It's condensed. Our Eisner mustn't die. She will not die. I won't permit it. She is not dying now because she is not allowed to. My steps are firm, but I repeat it 5, 6 more times. My steps are firm, and now the earth trembles. When I move, a buffalo moves. When I rest, a mountain reposes. She wouldn't dare to die. So it has this kind of quality of a invocation or incantation of powers way beyond me, and yet I felt completely confident that she wouldn't die. When I arrived, she was out of hospital. She was really dying when I heard from a friend of mine. And she didn't know that I was traveling on foot to come to her and see her alive. And she was out of hospital. And then 8 years later, she summoned me back to Paris. And she said, there's still this spell on me that I mustn't die. And I said, Lotte, it's lifted off now. And she died 8 days later. And it was right, felt good, it felt right. She couldn't read anymore, she was almost 90 years old, she couldn't read anymore, she couldn't see movies anymore, she could not walk anymore, and she said something very biblical, ich bin jetzt lebenssatt. And it's very Lutheran, biblical, I'm saturated of life, like Noah, age 930, saturated of life, died. And after him, his son, so and so, and it continues. Aged 900, I think 930 years that Noah lived. I have to check it in the Bible, I'm not completely sure, but something like that. Maybe it was only 880 years saturated of life. And that happened to Lotte Eisner.
So Werner, we heard you read the German, and I know that Amir, our colleague in German studies, has something to say about the prose style and the music of your style. So Amir, would you like to say
Sure.
a few things?
Is the mic working? Working. I was deeply moved reading the book in German and then listening to the book. Werner reads the entire book as an audio version. And these last few weeks, I listened to you, Werner, reading it several times. And I must say I was deeply, deeply moved. Partly, I think, because of the fact that, I didn't grow up, in Germany or with German. I grew up in Haifa in Israel, surrounded by survivors of the Holocaust. So the story of Lotte Eisner was something very moving to me as a story. But then listening to you speaking about this pilgrimage in German was especially another layer of emotional, involvement. And I had to think back of, my, youth, reading generation of German authors who, for me, presented a very different German than my fantasy about what German is. And I found your language here in this book echoing my experiences back then. So I see the book as following on the footsteps of this, giants generation at the beginning of someone like Heinrich Böll and Günter Grass, Siegfried Lenz, who really recreated German in a way we didn't know it before, and introduced to the world a German that obviously between 33 and 45 went, as they say, contaminated. And I think you find here a way to connect to the best tradition of German. Hölderlin's name was invoked here before, but also others who present a German that is quite different than what happened between 33 and 45. So this quality I find expressed here in incredible manner. And I think you're right, Werner, in saying that you will be for sure remembered for writing like this, because the German you present us here with is the German of the best tradition.
Yeah, but I see it more than just German. There's a worldview in it, and it is something more general than just some regional voice. There's something that appeals instantly to young people in Argentina or to people in Russia now. And there was just a few days ago, I think the modern Greek translation was finished and I think published. So it's very strange. It's recognized not just a voice of my generation and a voice of my German generation. It's something else as well.
So the musicality of it, I mean, listening to you, reading the book, I found myself struck by the sheer musicality of it. It has a certain tact, a certain rhythm, a certain Erfahrung, experience in the deepest sense of the word that I had listening to your voice, reading it. Maybe composing even. A lot of it reads as almost a musical composition.
Yes, but there was no time for composition. It was written spontaneously. Sometimes even walking I scribbled. Sometimes when the storm and the snow and the sleet and rain came horizontally at me, I would crouch for 10 minutes in a corner of an abandoned bus station and would scribble with frozen fingers. So and it has this truthful tone about it, because there was nothing that I ever considered for an audience to read it. It was obvious this was not meant for the eyes of anyone. There was something, and that makes it in a way strangely authentic. And it took 4 years until a publisher of Hansa Verlag, Michael Krüger, he asked me, I know your screenplays are so extraordinary, and do you have anything written? I said, yeah, well, I do have some diaries, fairly short text, and he said, I want to read it. And he said, you are not leaving this house, you are not leaving this room. And all of a sudden, other people, he had organized people from the publishing house, they blocked the entrance, they surrounded me in this, and he said to me, you have to publish this. This is beyond your private sort of writing, it's something for other eyes as well. And they would not let me move out, so I decided, yes, there must be something, and I had it published. And it's Wilder, even Conquest of the Useless, Eroberung des Nutzlosen. Number one, during writing of this, I was under extreme pressure. We had, and it was the time I did the film Fitzcarraldo, where I moved a big steamboat over a mountain. And we had 2 plane crashes, and we had, for example, a situation where we wanted to do this in the north of Peru, close to the Ecuadorian border, and all of a sudden a border war broke out and between Peru and Ecuador, and my camp for 1,100 people was burned to the ground. And on and on and on. My leading character, after halfway through the film shooting, fell ill, had to be sent to the United States and would not be allowed to return. So there was a true catastrophe every single day, and my handwriting shrank, strangely enough, to microscopic size. And later on I had to decipher it with a pair of glasses and some flip glasses that the jewelers are using. I tried to decipher it, and I tried it to read some of it some 6 years later. And it was so terrifying for me what I read that I couldn't continue after 20 or 30 pages. And then 26 years later, my wife, who is a very wonderful woman and prudent and farsighted, she said to me, you have to address this, because there's a text of apparently great caliber, and when you are dead, some idiot at some time will take hold of it, and not being able to decipher it correctly and making wrong assumptions is going to publish it. You have to address it. 26 years later, I looked into the text, and all of a sudden it came with great ease, and I transcribed it, and it's published now, Conquest of the Useless. But in this case, more than a quarter of a century that I couldn't read it even myself.
Can you say more, Werner, about the experience of writing it? I mean, to what extent was Lotte Eisner, on your mind as you were writing it? Or were you more, steeped in the process of walking, of crossing landscape, experiencing landscape? Is it a kind of a conversation with her, a dialogue, an internal dialogue with her while you're walking?
No, it's not really a dialogue. Sometimes she seems to be completely forgotten because I'm just moving on, and I'm moving into a realm of fantasy. There are incidents and things described that were pure fantasy, that are not, that did not happen. For example, I just half an hour ago I had a brief conversation about a moment in France where I was in a cafe, and outside there's a kiosk, and I urged an obese owner of the kiosk to sell me all the Kodak raw stock that he had, and he had tens of thousands of feet, piles of it, and I wanted to buy it all, but he rattled down the Venetian blinds and shut down the kiosk, and I said, now it's exactly 5 p.m., I'm not selling anything anymore. And things that are pure fantasy, or fantasizing about, I see a train that speeds along, and it speeds so fast that the wheels are glowing red hot, and the train goes straight into the universe and starts burning. There's a burning train going straight out into the starry night. So, of course, all these are events that are only events of an inner landscape. Some of it is description, much of it is description of an inner landscape. So it's a very strange shifting between realities.
You say in the address in her honor, printed at the end of the book, you said, I said to her, open the window, from these last days onward, I can fly. And you say elsewhere, she gave me, or she gave us, wings.
Yeah, and it's a beautiful word in German, beflügeln, meaning to somehow lift somebody, elevate somebody. Flügel means wings in German, and beflügeln means to inspire somebody, but giving somebody wings. And quite often there is fantasies about flying. I described that I'm a ski flyer now, and the spectators are agape. He doesn't stop flying. He's flying on and on and on, and he won't land. So, and in a way, these fantasies had to do with my fantasies as an adolescent, where I wanted to become world champion of ski flyers. I wanted to become an athlete. And these ambitions were dramatically cut short because of a near-fatal accident of my best friend at the time, who was literally dying in my arms, and I didn't know, should I put him down and wait until he was dead, or should I try to run to the village and summon help? So what I ultimately did, I carried him along in my hands, and I was lucky because after 15 or so, 20 minutes, a farmer came by and helped. So my friend lapsed into a coma, and woke up after 3 weeks, to everyone's surprise, to mine more than to anyone else's, because I was sure he was going to die. But the dream of flying had a catastrophic, abrupt, from 1 second to the next end. But the imagination of flying has never left me. And I regret that we cannot fly. I really think we are misconstrued creatures. We should be able to fly, and it makes me kind of angry that we can't. And at the end of the book, and there's something also strange, because may I read a little passage in English this time? What is also strange, because my language had come a little bit apart. I'm using expressions that are faulty German. For example, I said to her something very strange. Together wir werden ein Feuer kochen und Fische anhalten. We will cook a fire and stop fish. But you do not cook a fire, you cook a meal. And you do not stop, you stop traffic, but you do not stop fish. So, and it's very strange how my language comes apart, and I read this. As afterthought, just this, I went to Madame Eisner. She was still tired and marked by her illness. Someone must have told her on the phone that I had come on foot. I didn't want to mention it. I was embarrassed and placed my smarting legs. I had walked 85 kilometers a day, a night, and half a day, because I was tired of walking and wanted to end it. I was embarrassed and placed my smarting legs up on a second armchair, which she pushed over to me. In the embarrassment, a thought passed through my head, and since the situation was strange anyway, I told it to her. Together, I said, we shall boil fire and stop fish. Then she looked at me and smiled very delicately, and since she knew that I was alone on foot and therefore unprotected, she understood me. For one splendid fleeting moment, something mellow flowed through my deadly tired body. I said to her, open the window. From these last days onwards, I can fly. So it ends with flying.
Werner, can I ask then about the role of the earth or the land in the journey? Because there's a very strong presence of what is underfoot as you're walking on this thing. And forgive a slightly elaborate question, but you mentioned, it's the very first page of your Guide to the Perplexed. You said that at 14...
I have to mention it, the title is wonderful, but it was stolen from the Jewish philosopher Maimonides. Middle Ages, Civil. He had an almost identical title, and when I read this title, it was like lightning struck me. This is the best title I've ever seen in my life, so I had to steal it. Sorry for interrupting.
That's great. So you mentioned that at 14 you decided to convert to Catholicism. Your father was atheist, furious, and your mother thought it was because the local priests played football. But you say that you were fascinated by the historical tradition of Catholicism and its attention to ritual as opposed to other kinds of religion. So I guess I'm going to ask about the role of ritual and walking on the land. And here I'm going to be a little bit professorial.
Yeah.
Henry David Thoreau, the American philosopher, has an essay on walking. And I was looking at it in preparation for tonight, and he says that this English word to saunter,
Yes,
it's like to walk.
Santeria, without land, yeah.
He says there's two etymologies. One is santerre, and
Yeah.
the other is sanctitaire, holy land. And that to walk is to always be homeless on the one hand, but always be aware of the holy land that you're either seeking or that you're walking on. Did your trek across this part of Germany and France give you, on this land, did it give you a revelation? You said that the world reveals itself to those who walk. Did it become, who travel by foot, did it reveal a certain sanctity as such? The very earth and land of the European continent.
I think I say it even in the book verbatim, that from the feet comes the knowledge. The whole voyage had the quality of a pilgrimage. It had some. It's a ritual. It's a ritualized. Something is ritualized about it. I have little doubt, but it's not easy to talk about it, because when I speak and when you speak about sanctity, and so let's touch this expression only with a pair of pliers. We know that it would be misleading very, very quickly if we didn't somehow reflect the term. But I think Thoreau, of course, a very remarkable writer and human being. I didn't know his work about walking, but of course he's very close to my heart. And an experience, not so much, I think, in his case of traveling on foot, but living outside of the norms of society in his own reflection and existence in nature itself, in nothing else.
That's a santerre, the homeless.
Yeah, and santerre is without land. It's those who do not have any property. That's interesting. Not just homeless. They are those who have no property. In the same way, I understand, for example, Native Americans. They never saw the country as property. It's a very foreign term, and for me, the term property or owning something has been very, very strange for me.
Well, since you've mentioned flying, and we're talking about things, we have a question. I know that I solicited just a few questions from people, so I think, Becky, you have a question that's directly related to that. Can you get close to the mic?
I'll read it as I wrote it. I think we've already talked about it a little bit, but I'll ask again.
Please go
because I
ahead.
think there's still more to say. So I was struck by the presence of the animals in your journal. So there are ravens, pigs, dogs, sheep, jackdaws, parrots, horses, cattle, geese, chickens, cats, sparrows, mice, and even at one point, flying reptiles. And this connection to the animal world is so profound. At several points, you wonder if you are still looking human, as you do on page 22 and 101. I noticed this particular affinity to birds. Like the rainbow, you write on page 96, the cranes are a metaphor for him who walks. I'll just cite a few other bird examples. Let the storm blow me around the petrol station until I get wings, you write on page 22. I fly and don't stop, don't quit, don't look, fly on, you write later on. You dream of a palace in the treetops on page 36. In the very last line of the book, you write, as we've already spoken about, open the window, from these last days onwards I can fly. I don't take these references to flight lightly, and I wonder if what you are getting at is something even more powerful than metaphor. As you suggest in the tribute that you wrote to Lottie Eisner in 1982, and you said, you gave us wings, and I mean that quite literally. The way I read you, and I hope I haven't misread you, is that this story is not only about walking, but also about flight, as you have suggested. And I mean, there's two types of flight. On one hand, the getting away from, and the second, the soaring. There's a fleeing of death, a flight in the sense of escaping the socialized human world, but also this bird's eye perspective that your journey affords you. I wondered if you would be willing to say more about your connection to birds and animals and the way your stories, this story, but also maybe the stories you tell in your films, are told through them.
It's a profound question and not completely easy to answer. There's a very simple answer to it that's has to do with the realism of traveling on foot. And in snowstorms and in rain and so you do not see any humans, but you see mice more than you ever would imagine when you're in a car. You do not see the mice or dogs barking at you or cows running and converging and staring at you as if you were the solution and as you were the revelation of everything. So that's one side, but there's always a very strange type of bestiary. In particular, you see it a lot in my films, even much wilder. You see dancing chicken, or you see cannibalistic chicken, or you see radioactive mutant albino crocodiles in a film actually on a Paleolithic cave, paintings, the earliest that we have ever found, dating back to 35,000 years ago. So there's a strange bestiary in my films and clearly so in the writing. Where it exactly comes from, I do not know, but it probably has to do to some extent with my very intense nexus with nature. That's one thing, but it's also quite often the animals are transformed into something very odd, like the radioactive mutant albino crocodiles, or like the iguanas in Bad Lieutenant. You have a strange quality about them where they transcend all qualities of being animals, and in a way you see it not as clearly pronounced, but I do remember that I'm asking in one sentence, is friendship with mice possible? Yes, it is. It sounds like a very odd sentence, but it makes a lot of sense in a larger context. And of course, I'm not somebody who is having any tendency of tree hugging, for example. I think that's a grotesque sort of form of showing affection to nature. My affection to nature is different. But it comes up all the time, and I'm becoming much more aware because you are asking the question. But I think we have to go through details here, and we have to go through very much so details in films that I have made where it becomes visible and obvious, more obvious than in the text.
You mentioned tree hugging, and there's another question that we have about, if not hugging a tree, then shaking a tree. Could we have Maria Masuko?
Yeah, I was serendipitous, actually.
Close to, yeah.
Yeah, I've got. So you have this moment. I think I'd like to read a piece of it at least. Definitely not tree hugging, but you come across a grove of trees, and you say that the apples are lying rotting in the wet clay soil around the trees. Nobody's harvesting them. On one of the trees, which seemed from afar like the only tree left with any leaves, apples hang in mysterious clusters close to one another. There isn't a single leaf on the wet tree, just wet apples refusing to fall. Picked one up, it tasted pretty sour, but the juice in it quenched my thirst. So then you toss this core, it's on page 87, against the tree, and some of the apples fall like rain. And When the apples had grown still again, restful on the ground, you go on, I thought to myself that no one could imagine such human loneliness. It is the loneliest day, the most isolated of all. So I went and shook the tree until it was utterly bare. In the midst of the stillness, the apples pummeled the ground. When it was over, a haunting stillness grabbed me and I glanced around, but no one was there. I was alone. Upon reading this, I had two simultaneous reactions. On the one hand, I thought, I've definitely done this, but I don't think I actually have. I just had the sense that it was a somewhat instinctive, universal reaction, and shaking a tree was the perfect image for it. And on the other hand, I thought to myself, how on earth could you come across unripe apples in December? And the combination of these two reactions told me that something's going on in this scene, and I wonder if it has to do with the way you describe it as particularly human loneliness. What about a tree expressed your human loneliness in that moment? And do you remember it, and what could you tell us about this scene?
I do remember it, and it was truly a tree. Sometimes you see apple trees or other trees that are not harvested, and the leaves are all gone during the fall and beginning of winter, and still the tree was full of apples, and it was very. It was the loneliest, the deepest solitude that I've experienced on this trek on foot, and. It's very strange. What do you do? I was curious, and I tasted one, and it tasted sour, and I threw the core into the tree, and they pummeled down some of the apples, and then I had the feeling that the apples should be where they should be at that time. They should be on the ground, and I shook the apple tree very, very violently, and all the apples pummeled down, and the strange thing is when they are all down and they rest, and I'm saying it in German in a very strange, stylized Bavarian, und als sie am Boden eine Ruhe gaben, they gave a quiet. So it's not proper German, it's a stylized Bavarian expression. Then all of a sudden silence and solitude struck me as deep as I'd never experienced it before or after. And until today, I have not had the sense of such utter abandon and solitude. It's not just a solitude because there's no humans around. It's a very existential form of solitude. And I've thought quite often about it because I do believe that solitude of men differs from solitude of women. It's a strange thing that gives a clear distinction between men and women. When you see female solitude, which apparently has different forms and different forms of expressions. So I've thought beyond that moment, which is a key moment in this book.
Werner, in English, of course, there's two words, solitude and loneliness. The word that your translator chose there is loneliness, where
Yes.
solitude can be even blissful and
Yes.
and it's an occasion to commune with oneself in an expansive way. Loneliness is a sense of privation, of being deprived of human company. And many of the people that you come across throughout your journey are full of loneliness from your perception of them, no? So you're not the only lonely person.
No, of course not. Everyone has that in him or in her. And I do remember I made a film in Bavaria, and much of it in Bavarian dialect. It's called Heart of Glass. And it's a very strange film because the actors are acting under hypnosis, but so deep in hypnosis that they would open their eyes without waking up from the state of hypnosis. And there's a cowherd, a herdsman, a prophet at the end of the 18th century who made prophecies. And there's a something that struck me very much, and it's in the film, and he prophesizes that all human beings have left the planet, and the prophet prophesizes, and I see a man on the forest road running with a burning branch in his hand, and he's shouting, "Am I really the only one? Am I really the last?" So that's kind of existential. If there's nobody, and quite often I think about a situation where I or somebody would be the only one surviving and last one. And that's why I was so fascinated by the work of my wife Lena, who did an oratorio, Last Whispers, where she created a composition, an oratorio from tape recordings of already extinct languages. And some speakers where there's only one single last final remaining speaker in the world remaining. And this must be unspeakable, a solitude that is completely and utterly unspeakable, and that has somehow a faint echo of that. Of course, you find of Walking in Ice, but my experiences or the experiences of my wife have deepened this understanding of solitude.
So this condition of loneliness, of being alone, of being the last on the earth or being extinct, raises also the specter of our planet, which seems to be the only one which has any life on it. And we have a question from Andrea Capra about this moment of Walking in Ice that relates to this.
Yes, and perhaps this is one of the inner landscapes that you mentioned before. I would like to read this passage that really struck me. It's at page 51 of the English edition, and I quote, "In the pitch blackness of the universe, the wheels are glowing, the lone car is glowing, unimaginable stellar catastrophes take place, entire worlds collapse into a single point, light can no longer escape, even the profoundest blackness would seem like light, and the silence would seem like thunder. The universe is filled with nothing. It is the yawning black void. Systems of Milky Ways have condensed into unstars. Utter blissfulness is spreading, and out of utter blissfulness now springs the absurdity." My question would be the following. In your book, I believe, the senses prevail. There are indeed many passages that describe sensations such as the fatigue of walking, the discomfort of freezing temperatures, the pains of hunger. I would like to ask you, Werner Herzog, where does this pitch blackness of the universe come from? Does it come from your sense experience? Is it one of those inner landscapes, or is it from some other realm? And what is the role of cosmic nihilism in your journey, and why do you tie it to blissfulness? Thank you.
The last thing is the most mysterious, blissfulness. I can't even reflect back on how this sentence came into my mind. But of course, what I'm describing is almost describing of black holes that were pretty much, I think, unknown at the time, or not in the popular convention of thinking. But yet, and I do believe that when you are out there and when you imagine yourself out there in the universe and you move away from our planet, which we have seen many, many decades later after I wrote this, there are photos of planet Earth like a tiny dot somewhere, and there's nothing but darkness around and tiny specks of light. So ultimately it's pretty dark and pretty cold out there and pretty chaotic. There's something completely chaotic and unbalanced out there. We have had, at least since, let's say, Aristotle, or even before him, a notion that the universe out there was composed of spheres, and the outermost sphere was perforated and a permanent fire out there was shining through. Those were the stars. But the idea of a harmonious universe out there and the harmony of spheres is a mistake that has been around in philosophy and natural history for 2 millennia or so almost. And it still is lingering away and in a way, and those who have a tendency to be into new age quasi sort of philosophical babble, those who hug the trees, they would still speak about the universe being in harmony. No, it is not. It is chaotic and murderous and not good to be out there. And all attempts to colonize, all thinking of colonizing Mars, for example, is an obscenity. It is a sheer obscenity. Number one, we will not do it. We will eventually send 2 or 3 scientists out there, fine, and they will survive in a small shelter that's as large as a phone booth, basically. But we are not going to colonize it, and there will be not, like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos believe, have 1 million people out there. It's not going to happen. And as we have seen in the last century, the demise and the bankruptcy of social utopias like communism, paradise on earth, like fascism, a master race that would somehow spread over all the planet, and the catastrophes it has brought over the human race. Now, this century we are living in will show the bankruptcy of technological utopias. We will not colonize Mars. We will not become immortal. It's baloney. And we will have the proof during this very century. And we should rather make sure that our planet, which is the only home we have, should stay inhabitable instead of making a completely hostile environment like on Mars somehow inhabitable. Everything else is too far away. You do not spend 220,000 years to reach Alpha Centauri, which is only 4.5 light years away. It will take you with the highest speeds you can ever, that a human body can sustain in form of acceleration and deceleration, will take you 120,000, 200,000 years. It's not going to happen. So,
I fundamentally agree. Well, the unimaginable human catastrophe, so to
pardon,
speak.
say it again.
No, that was the unimaginable human catastrophe that you just described.
Yeah, in a way, yes, but at the moment when you are walking and you see some sort of a gravel pit in front of you yawning and a fire flickering down there, it all of a sudden triggers something strangely cosmic in the deadly tired body and mind. And all of a sudden I'm describing a train that goes into the universe and unstars, Unsterne, being swallowed up or something. It's very, very strange terms that are not German words either. There's no such thing as an Unstar, an Unstern. There's Unglück, discomfort or disaster, but not a dis-star or unstar.
So maybe as a follow-up to this fascinating question and conversation, Werner, do you think there's an ethical dimension in the book, namely, instead of these technological fantasies or ludicrousys, you urge us to walk, to re-experience, re-inhabit the soil on which we're stepping? Would you agree to that? That walking is your alternative to those flights into outer space?
No, we should do flights into outer space. It's wonderful, and it's phenomenal that we are sending a robot on an asteroid, and it's fantastic that we have Hubble telescope, which opens our eyes to unimaginably beautiful formations out there, chaotic and dangerous, but incredible to look at. But maybe there's something subversive about it, that traveling on foot is something fundamental human, and finding humanness and the truth and meaning in what our existence is all about. Those who travel on foot experience it firsthand. And when young filmmakers come to me and ask me about advice, what should they do? And it's not only that I should say that to young filmmakers, it should be to those who study literature and to those who study medicine or whatever, mathematics. Walk, travel on foot. That's one of the things, two things. And the second is read. If you don't read, you will be a mediocre architect or a mediocre filmmaker at best, but you will not do the real intense and beautiful things. You have to read, and I see it even in academia, even in fairly good universities like this one here. I see that students are not reading enough. But it's a long sort of historical evolution. It has started 40 years ago, 50 years ago, long before the internet. But the internet has accelerated the disaster that we are not reading enough anymore.
Yeah, I would add a comment here about the possible connection between walking and literature, poetry especially, because I don't think we appreciate nearly enough the degree to which poetic rhythm has its basis in the walking on uneven surfaces. I've noticed that a lot of students have rarely walked on uneven surfaces like land and uphills and crooked things. And when it's always an even pavement type of walking, it's very hard to understand the difference between iambic meter and an anapestic, or the way in which the actual prosody of a poem.
Hexameters are very good sort of impulse in walking.
Right. And so I would say probably the best training for someone who is aspiring to be a poet is just walking on the land that has not been paved. But that is just a speculation I throw out there.
Well, it has formed quite a few very important poets. The most important of all in my language, German, would be Hölderlin, who has traveled on foot a lot. And you see, there's a wonderful short text, something like only 35 pages by Georg Büchner, written in the 1820s or so, shortly before he died. And it's called Lenz, about the Sturm und Drang poet Lenz, who became insane, and he travels on foot over the mountains, and he travels actually exactly, some of it is exactly the same thing in the Vosges mountains in left Rhine, the French First Mountains, and Fouday and places, Waldersbach. And I, by coincidence, because I was traveling the straightest line between Munich and Paris, came across some 15, 20 kilometers that Lenz had traveled on foot. And he ends up as one of the great voices of his time as a poet, but completely insane. And Hölderlin also becoming insane. And another one, a very, very wonderful Swiss writer, Robert Walser, not the German writer Martin Walser. I speak of Robert Walser, who wrote some of the finest and strangest prose that we have in the 20th century. He traveled on foot a lot, and he also ended up insane. It's strange, and sometimes I keep thinking, how do I keep my sanity, and what do I have to watch out for? So I'm vigilant. I'm trying to be vigilant.
This leads to the last kind of solicited questions, after which we can open it up. But
Yeah.
Corey Dansero?
Yeah, sorry, improvising just to not backtrack, but I notice often that the walk uphill is a movement towards a kind of unreality or a strangeness. The footpath over Schalksberg, there's no path recognizable, the trees and bushes seem completely unreal, and then you, from that height, you look down with contempt and you say, lower down, it's ugly and wet and meaningless compared to the footpath over the heights. Another moment, you're climbing higher and higher, and there's a moment where you say, it will be unpleasant beyond that height. So I see that constant ascending towards a surreal or unreal stratosphere or height. But then there's a sense of danger where you can tell sometimes that it might be unpleasant to go further. And if it gets more unreal, then maybe you'll lose control altogether and go insane. So yeah, I wonder, my question was originally about writing and about how writing itself is sort of a height where there's less inhibition, you can see far. There's a part where you say the gaze flies far in all directions, and it seems like writing itself allows your thoughts to fly really quickly. And I wonder if there's something to be said about how writing is a form or a medium that would lead to sort of an insanity, and maybe you need to hold yourself back by tying yourself to the equipment of filmmaking that somehow maybe keeps you grounded in some way.
I have not noticed it myself. It's a very interesting observation, and I have to look into my own writing, but I think you describe something correctly, that on an ascent, I seem to move into the unreal, into the realm of fantasy. Maybe that it's a form of exhaustion that plays into it, but it's not just that. It's a prose of ascent that takes you into something that is higher beyond ourselves, something sublime, that Longinus, for example, describes very well about his letter on the sublime. And it means the elevated, the existence and reality all of a sudden is lifted up into something transcendent. It's very strange because it's a practical form of ascending, of ascent. Yes, I think you have a remarkable observation here. I may add something which is not really related. I read Xenophon's Anabasis, the ascent, in antiquity, and he describes a very, very strange moment, a wonderful, direct moment that he witnessed with his riders, and the starving soldiers had stretched out, the entire army had stretched out over something like 50 kilometers, and the vanguard and the rear guard were attacked by local troops, and it was a war of attrition, and they were starving and thirsty and hoping for reaching the Black Sea. And he describes a moment where he sees very far into the distance, kilometers into the distance at the height of this trail, and he sees a commotion, an incredible commotion, and people's flailing their arms, and he thinking there might be an attack, summons his generals and summons the best of the best troops. But then he notices that some sort of shout is coming down. One person shouting to the next and shouting, it comes like wildfire at him, and they shout, Thalasar, Thalasar, the sea, the sea. And it passes by him, and 50 kilometers later, the shout, the sea stops, as if the sea was an apparition and not combat, an imaginary combat that had happened. It was something divine that they had observed. I think it has nothing to do with what we are discussing here, but it just came to my mind anyway. Sorry for digressing.
On the note of the divine, also in Psalm, there's a group of psalms called, the songs of the ascent. And I think there's a psalmic quality to this text. Also, when you think about
I have
solitude,
to go back into the Psalms because they are some of my consolation in deepest turmoil and distress. The book of Job and the Psalms, and Livy, Second Punic War. Those are my consolations, my anchors.
in solitude.
Now in deep turmoil and distress, sometimes combined with solitude when nobody would ever believe anymore I could hoist this big steamboat over a mountain, and you are deserted, and when you are deserted among many who have not fled the scene but they are still around, and you sense that they are looking at you and trying to hold you and stop you from your own insanity, from your plan that cannot be performed into reality. So that's a kind of moments where I would grab the Psalms or the book of Job.
As I said, defiance is a leitmotif. Do we have any questions from all of you who made the effort to read the book and come and join us? Paulina.
I have a lot of questions, but for the first,
Closer.
Can you speak up a
the
little bit
microphone.
here?
I'm curious about the blurring of the real and the film world in your work. I was reminded of Krakauer's Calico-Welt-Aufsatz, and he talks about how the film world has overtaken reality. And in the film Burden of Dreams, you say, everyday life is an illusion behind which lies the reality of dreams. And I'm very curious about that because you also have in this work lines like, and I'll say it in German, Man bräuchte ein Fernglas, nur wenn es Film wäre, würde ich das alles für wahr halten. So that you require sort of this intervening element of the film lens in order to make the things that you're witnessing real. And there's a pervading sense of not only alienation from your surroundings and your landscape, but also from the people. The form of the narration is the indirect speech, and I'm just very curious about how these two realms exist for you.
What you quoted was from Fitzcarraldo, a dialogue from Fitzcarraldo that behind everyday life lies a reality of dreams. That's a belief system of the native people in the jungle. But of course, very often in my films, you see a departure from reality into clearly into a world of dreams and imagination. And you have also seen probably clearly in documentaries where I depart from the factual, from the reality, where I modify realities in such a way that it resembles truth more than reality. I'm moving away from facts in order to create some sort of an illumination. So it's all pervading in my films, and it's in a way pervading the things that I write. From one sentence to the next, I continue into a sheer dream, into sheer poetry. And it's never been foreign to me to switch from one step to the next into a dream form of reality. The strange thing in all this is that I do not dream, but I do have vivid sort of dream experiences when I travel on foot. That does happen. Sometimes it happens when I drive long distance in a car. All of a sudden, the entire car is filled with butterflies, and they are flying and floating around, and I cannot see clearly enough anymore. And I try to clear the air and hold the straight line on the freeway. And those are the moments where I know you have to stop. And I drive, no matter where I am, I drive onto the shoulder, and I try to swat the dreams away, because it would be very dangerous to drive on with a car filled with about 2,000 butterflies. It's not right. You just don't drive anymore. But what you are pointing at is also that literally from one image to the next, or from one sentence to the next, all of a sudden it's a dreamlike quality. It's something not real, an unreal, irreal sort of world that I describe. I must say it is deeply what poetry, I think, does. And correspondingly, cinema is doing the same sometimes. And there should be more like that.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to follow up on that question a little bit. As much as the book and your films have this switch from something real to something fantasy, or it can happen very, within the same scene, I was struck a lot by the humor in the book that we all read for today. I mean, a lot of it struck me as very funny, especially like most vividly with like the town you come into and like everyone's obese, and it's like, okay. Or like the ending, sometimes the turn into the fantasy world seems to be very, like a very kind of funny thing, like the end of Bad Lieutenant, where like Nicolas Cage, all of his problems are like immediately solved. Or when Michael Shannon's character in My Son, What Have You Done, like after taking 2 flamingos hostage, comes out and tells the police officer, like, forget about the flamingos, I see ostriches. And then you have this kind of great associate, like
ostriches in drag.
Ostriches in drag, exactly. Yeah, very funny. And then we see a bunch of ostriches running, and it's like, wow, that's like, I found those really rich in their kind of. They don't necessarily mean anything literal, but the shifts often have a kind of, as much as a change in register between reality, also like in tone, and often, at least for me, like humor. And I just want to ask you about sure. that.
Yeah, there's always humor, and of Walking in Ice has a lot of it. I see a Santa Claus looking so bizarre that I can't burst out laughing in the crowd, so I flee into a cafe and still see him outside the window, and my face is frozen, but I hold on to the table, and the table starts to rattle so hard that the waiter looks at me, and I'm embarrassed, and I flee to the men's room or something like that. So it's, yes, there's always a form of humor, but sometimes you mentioned Bad Lieutenant. There's a very significant, strange moment where it was not in the screenplay, but I introduced iguanas on the coffee table of some homicide detectives who, from an empty apartment, are watching a suspect who lives across the street, apparently. And Nicolas Cage comes in and he says, "What are these iguanas doing here on my coffee table?" And the other detectives look at the coffee table and they say, there ain't no iguanas. But he is in such a haze of drugs that he sees the iguanas. The funny thing is, we as an audience also see the iguanas. And it is a very significant moment, because we as an audience and he, the Bad Lieutenant, all of a sudden form a conspiracy over something imagined that only he can see, but we also see it. And it's a very fine moment, and it only dawned on me that it was more than just an impulse, that I had seen an iguana in a branch of a tree, and I said, "Get me that iguana, please, 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 get it quickly." And so, and in hindsight, it had much deeper significance, and it's a very hilarious moment where everybody laughs. Of course, beyond the humor, there lies a different, deeper meaning that's anchored in it. And very often the laughter, the strange scenes when I I buy something and I'm trying to shop something, and all of a sudden my voice is only high-pitched and squeaky, and I don't know what to do now. The way it's described is kind of funny and has, and yet it points always at something stranger and deeper.
That leads to a question that I have, if you don't, because my colleague Laura Whitman and I are teaching a course on symbolism, literary symbolism. Yeah. And there are theories of the symbol that, you know, what you see, there's a deeper, as you said, there's a deeper reality behind it, and can you actually, how can you penetrate it? And so to make the question very simple, do you believe in symbols? Do you conceive of some of the stuff in your films as, and your books, obviously, as having a symbolical character?
I do have difficulties with that because I've never seen the world or existence manifesting itself in form of symbols. I have a very strange relationship to it. Also, I do not really know what a metaphor is, and I do not understand irony. I do understand humor very well, which is very different from irony, because irony always means seeing some sentence that is said to you with a different, separate layer of meaning. And that's what gives me my problem with the French language. You sit in a cafe and everybody immediately starts to address me with ironic sort of questions. And I answer back like a Bavarian bullfrog behind his stein of beer. I answer straight back and I startle them. So in the similar thing, I've been asked about Fitzcarraldo, the ship over the mountain. Yes, I do know it's a big metaphor, but metaphor for what, I do not know. But I know it's a deep, very, very big metaphor.
Well, that's one of the thing about the symbols is that, as a college teacher of mine said, if a symbol refers to anything specific, it's not a symbol. So maybe that boat is exactly that kind of symbol that doesn't have, cannot be translated into something conceptual.
But academia is trying it very hard, and I think it's and I think it's very sometimes counterproductive, and it kills off sense of poetry. So that's just a kick I want to do under the table. But
they can see what's going on.
Yeah, true, yeah. But I think I've always been cautious about symbols, and in particular when it came to the film I made on the Paleolithic cave, Cave of Forgotten Dreams. And there's something very mysterious. You do have palm prints, not just handprints or negative prints, where you would spray paint with a pipe or with your spitting paint around, and then you remove the paint and you have a negative handprint. But there are also positive prints in ochre in the cave at various locations, clusters of palm prints, roundish sort of prints. And we know that with all probability it was just one person, because in quite a few of them a crooked, probably broken little finger is also printing with it that stood away from the palm. So, and deeper into the cave we find the same sort of palm print. And there's huge studies of exegesis, what kind of symbol this might be and what it signifies, and what this cluster in counterbalance to a lower cluster might mean, and the symbolism explained. And I was sitting with one of these scientists who's come up with wild theories, and I said to him and to the other gentlemen, can I be prosaic? We do not know what these clusters mean, but how about this kind of explanation that I would come up with? The people who did these cave paintings must have been very young because you died between 25 and 35. So, and a young man, every single time he got laid in the cave, left a palm print there. So could it be that one? And they were very indignant that I was so prosaic. But what I'm trying to say is that sometimes I'm suspicious about reading too much symbolism into movies, for example, or my movies. Of course, there are forms of art that live almost exclusively of symbolism, but it's not where I feel very, very familiar. I'm not at home there.
Yeah. It's true, and the academic hermeneutic attempt to translate something that is symbolic into conceptual form is not really what even the poets who theorize about the symbol the most, where the symbol is something that is so strange and bizarre that it places you in the midst of the incomprehensible, and you stay there in the midst of the incomprehensible. That's when a symbol is really doing its work.
If you say it like that, I feel very, I feel totally at ease now.
Do we have time for one? Yeah, one last question maybe. Truman, did I see your hand up? Yeah.
But you are hidden behind the
Hi,
column
yeah,
here. I
I'll come
cannot
out.
see you here.
So when you talked about how nobody today walks anymore, I began thinking about probably the most famous major exception today, which are the refugees from Central America. And although there's a lot of differences between their walking and your walking, I was thinking also about the similarities. For example, their defiance of death, some conception of life, a better life maybe, or more meaningful life, and also your traversal of national boundaries. So it's a very general question, but I actually wanted to ask you because in a way I think you would make a great documentarian for their struggle in some ways because of the gargantuan epic task before them. So it's very general, but I'm just wondering what you think.
Well, it's a deep question, and you are pointing at the huge trek of tens of thousands who collectively have been trekking, I think, mostly from Honduras, crossing into Mexico and traveling on foot all across Mexico, all the way to the North American boundaries. Very hard to fathom the experience because it is driven by despair, and it is driven by hope, and much of it, of course, is a fantasy when you look at how rigid American politics is at this very moment, shutting down the borders. So it's a very, very precarious situation, and the questions, of course, are very profound that have to be asked, and they have to be asked on various levels. As to me doing a film on it, you see, in the last 12 months I've made 3 long films, and that's more than others make in 8 years. And I've been constantly somehow working, and of course I noticed what was going on, but while I was working in Japan on doing a feature film, for example, things happened, and I only got it in very small bits and pieces over Japanese television, which I couldn't understand anyway, but you could tell what was going on. But I think the question is more a question outside of cinema. It has to do with a human situation, and it has to do with monumental tragedies. And there is no, if there was an easy answer, anyone would immediately come up with. And the main thing is probably that you as Americans have to change, first and foremost, a climate. There has to be a different climate. And that's, speaking of changing a climate, is something which is very hard to do, but it has to do, for example, also with the neglect of the heartland of America, and I'm speaking of Wisconsin, and I'm speaking of Arkansas, and I'm speaking of these. They have created a government that was born out of a deep neglect, deep disenfranchisement of a whole part of the population. And I think you are working and living and studying at the western margins and the eastern margins, Harvard and Boston and New York and Washington. They spoke to me about, there are the flyovers, and I always was alarmed, and I found it scandalous. Take care of the center of America. Make your contacts to your old high school buddies in Omaha, Nebraska, or in Lawrence, Kansas, because then you change a climate, and the climate will lead to a different type of government, and legislation and attempts to build walls will probably vanish as if it had been a nightmare only. So it cannot be solved on the level of movies. But it's a very, very deep subject, and I think there are young filmmakers who accompanied the trek and made films from within, which I hope to see one day soon.
Werner Herzog, you all, thank you.